Before I introduce our speakers, I want to share a bit about our month-long kindness campaign. The Department of Student Life, along with the music department, has kicked off this campaign to help us remember Martin Luther King's legacy of service and kindness. In his words, "Not everybody can be famous, but everybody can be great, because greatness is determined by service. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love." The Kindness Campaign provides an opportunity to do something great. It offers simple, daily suggestions of service and kindness between now and February 14th. The calendar is available at SVSA's Instagram page. We will first hear from our two vice presidents of SVU's Black Student Union. Deja Benjamin, a sophomore from Aiea, Hawaii, is studying liberal arts. She will be followed by her husband, Michael Benjamin, a senior from Prince George, Virginia, studying history. Our final speaker is Andrew Evans. Andrew graduated from Southern Virginia University in 2014. Since then, he has earned a Juris Doctorate from the J. Reuben Clark Law School and a Master's in Public Administration from Brigham Young University. He now works as a Veterans Law Fellow at the Legal Aid Society of Columbus. We welcome him back to campus. Following the program, we will sing Love One Another. The closing prayer will be offered by Activity Senator Will Edwards from Henderson, Nevada. Deja.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good day today on this cold and rainy day. Oh my goodness. Okay. So, I'm from Aiea, Hawaii. I was born there. I was born in Kaiser Hospital. I live in Buena Vista now with my husband, Michael, and I'm co-vice president of Black Student Union. Today, I'm going to talk to you guys about Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King, and my personal experiences with some racism. To start with Martin Luther King Jr., he fought for change, and he did some incredible things, and he planted the seed for a lot of reactions to be set off, and he started and succeeded on the road to change. And while the reactions that he set off, they weren't all positive, I think it's really inspiring that one man could inspire thousands of people across the United States. Dr. King also paved the way for a lot of healthy lifestyles and healthy things to be available to African Americans across the country, such as good doctors, healthy and clean bathrooms, clean water fountains, things that we wouldn't really think are major today, but they were huge back then. I would also like to bring to light the sacrifices that Coretta Scott King made. They didn't make exactly the same sacrifices, but they were just as major. Coretta Scott would often not know if Dr. King would be returning safe all the time, and so that kind of left life up to a lot of guessing, and that's not exactly an ideal way to live, but she did it. She was a very strong woman. She took care and raised their kids, oftentimes, a lot of times, by herself, and that while maintaining kind of the shell, saying that everything's okay and everything's fine, while also worrying about her husband. That's a lot to deal with. And oftentimes, Dr. King would call their house and try to update Coretta on his situation, but if she missed that call, she wouldn't be able to call him right back like how we are today. So a lot of times, she would get her updates from news stations, which were very biased back then. And while these sacrifices that both these people made were amazing, they were selfless, and they were movements toward a bigger goal, unfortunately, racism is still alive and well today. Before I came here, I lived in Hawaii, and I never really experienced any racism, but when I moved to Virginia, it was like a totally different environment. While working at a local business, I experienced some not ideal behavior from some customers. They would get frustrated with me, and they would say rude and racist things about me under their breath, and they assumed that I couldn't hear them, but whether I heard them or not, it still hurts. And that affected my mental view greatly about a lot of things and a lot of people. And I believe that if we didn't share the same skin tone, you would view me in a negative light. But I had to grow out of that mindset, and I had to really realize that not everybody is like that. And being at SVU, because the people here are great, so being at SVU really helped me come out of that mindset. And I really appreciate how loving everybody is here. And as Vice President of Black Student Union, I must uphold this positive mindset and enforce it in everything I do in life. And while there is still racism today, I believe that with positive energy and a drive for change, we all can influence the people around us and get to that end goal of everybody working and living together with zero bias. And before I leave and pass the stage to my husband, I would like to leave you guys with this quote by Coretta Scott King. "Hatred is too great a burden to bear. It injures the hater more than it injures the hated." Thank you for having me up here on stage to speak to you guys, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Hey everyone, how's everybody doing today? Am I too loud? Or is it just right? Just right? Okay, cool. I'm Mike Benjamin. I'm from Prince George, Virginia, 804, born and raised. I'm a senior this year. Oh, the clicker. I'm a senior this year, born and raised. I'm from the 804, born and raised, and I'm a senior this year. I just finished my last year of football. Shout out to all the guys over here. Can I get a hoo-hoo? Okay, cool. I have one younger sibling, my little sister, Rebecca. I'm married to the beautiful woman that just spoke up here, Deja. And I'm a father of one, as you can see. I'm blessed to be here talking to you guys today. I'm thankful for you guys for having me. I came to SVU mostly because of my friends telling me that it was a good school. I'm not of LDS faith, so when I first got here for my visit, I wasn't knowing what to expect. But when I got here, I was received with open arms, and people were very loving, and I felt like part of a family. So I decided to spend my 4 years here. But today I want to talk about Dr. King's legacy and the impact he's had on my life. There are plenty of things that I can say about Dr. King. One is that he went to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, when he was 15 years old. Super young. Cool picking MLK right there. He skipped the 9th and the 12th grade, and he was a doctor of theology. He was a very, very bright man. And I honestly think that Dr. King could have been successful in whatever he chose to be a part of. But he chose to use his talents for the greater good and not just the benefit of himself. Dr. King wasn't just a smart man. He was a wise man. Dr. King knew that unless he's fulfilling his calling, he wouldn't be happy in life. Which brings me to my next point. This is my mother and I. She is Rochelle Benjamin. From a very, very young age, I knew my mother was a go-getter. She was a hustler, and she could do everything to provide for me and my little sister. When I was growing up, she had a job that she worked very, very long hours, and she couldn't be there all the time like she wanted to be. And on top of that, she wasn't getting the pay that she thought she deserved. And I wasn't sure if that was because she was a person of color or because she was a woman, but it is what it is. Now, then one day she came home and told us that she wanted to be a teacher. Me and my sister were ecstatic. We were super happy because we knew teachers got the summer off. So we planned vacations, we planned trips to go places. And but part of taking that job means she would take a bigger pay cut. In Virginia, first-year teachers don't make a lot of money, so she took the risk and she took the job. And she stuck it out. She showed perseverance. She got some years under her belt. I proved her pay over time. And I'm proud to say in May of 2018, my mother earned her master's in education. And that's her right there. Thank you. She is now a principal in Northern Virginia, and she's very, very happy. I've never seen her happier. She comes home and talks about her job, and I can see the joy coming out of her face. She's doing what she loves, truly. Teaching kids from all different ways of life, races, religion, anything you can think of. And in that way, I truly think that she is pushing Dr. King's dream forward. So, leaving you guys with one more thing, I just want to say, don't ever, ever be afraid to dream and take risks. Thank you.
A little shorter. Apologize. Oh. Can you hear me, SVU? Okay. Good morning. One more time. Good morning. One more time. Good morning. Thank you. I actually want you to all stand up. Look to your left and to your right. Shake your neighbor's hand, look them in the eye, and tell them, God loves you and so do I. Okay. If you've ever been to a black church, you might have been greeted that way. I had the privilege to attend Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King preached a couple of years ago after he was there. And before the sermon started, everybody stood up, looked each other in the eye, and said, "God loves you, and so do I." I thought that was a great way to start. I actually taught Institute for a year while I was in grad school, and would start every class the same way. But thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I love this university. So much has changed. For one, the colors have changed. I'm wearing the original Kelly green tie out of just silent defiance. But the red looks good. I like the red. The population has increased. There's quite a few more students than I've ever seen. And the facilities have improved. This is a nice-looking place. And one thing that changed that struck me was the mission. So when I was a student, the mission of the university was it invited us to become leader servants in our homes, communities, our churches, our nation, and in the world. And it was honestly part of the inspiration behind me serving in the military and serving a mission for my church and going to law school. But now our mission's shifted. Now the mission is to gather faithful Latter-day Saints and like-minded students, lift them in intellect, character, and spirituality, and launch them into successful lives and careers. Now, despite this change in terminology, I think the gather, lift, and launch is kind of catchy, so I like it. I believe that same spirit of service and leadership is embedded in the culture of this university. As servant leaders, we have a duty to gather, to lift, and to launch each other into greatness. We have the responsibility to be active participants in our communities. We have a duty to be what Dr. King might call be on the moral offensive. I've titled my speech, The Moral Offensive, The Legacy of Dr. King. The moral offensive is a term Dr. King used briefly to describe his work in Albany. In 1961, Dr. King was invited to assist in protests in Albany by Dr. Anderson. He was a black surgeon in the area, was fed up with the racism, and started to implement these protests. The day after King got there, he was arrested, along with 700 other protesters. The protest was unremarkable when you consider Selma and Birmingham, these other great and notable events. But King had this to say: "In short, our movement had taken the moral offensive, enriching our people with a spirit of strength to fight for equality and freedom, even if the struggle is to be long and arduous." The moral offensive was successful. King noticed a shift for the residents in Albany. They were empowered, strengthened by their just cause. Instead of sitting idly by and passively accepting racial segregation, the residents acted, and the effects rippled through the South. As students, alumni, faculty, staff, as a Southern Virginia family, we too have a responsibility to be on the moral offensive. We have a duty to be active participants in the fight for what's right. Many of us, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, have made sacred covenants to consecrate our lives, our talents, and everything we have to building the kingdom, to gather, to lift, and to launch. These are solemn responsibilities. In keeping with the theme of Dr. King, and because of our current social political climate, I'd like to focus his legacy on the things that I believe he would talk about, that are most important in the moral offensive. So in 1967, Dr. King gave a speech that's a classic but also controversial. It's been called The Three Evils of Society. I think we tend to forget that Dr. King was very controversial during his time, even among African Americans. But the speech lays out quite persuasively, I think, the three root evils of society: racism, poverty, and war. It's a unique perspective, but I think he's right. Many, if not all, of society's problems can be traced back to one of those evils: slavery, tribalism, economic exploitation, abuse. All these things have some sort of link to one of those ills. I'm not here to provide any specific or political remedies to these, but I'd like to take the time to share how we might experience these evils in our time, using scriptures, personal observations, and the life of Dr. King. I hope you will feel the Spirit as I speak, and will be prompted to consider how you, as a member of the Southern Virginia family, can be on the moral offensive in combating racism, poverty, and violence, or war. The first evil of our modern society is racism. We're privileged to grow up in America where civil rights legislation is passed, and people of all races have much more opportunity than was ever available. But although it's generally condemned, racially motivated violence still exists. Coded language and racially charged implications still pervade our socio-political context. And the vestiges of racist laws, institutions, and philosophy still wreak havoc in our communities. I doubt many of us are guilty of the outright intentional evils of racism. I think much better of us. But what I wonder is if we're guilty of some of the more subtle aspects of racism in the forms of ignorance, misinformation, and a lack of compassion. In a historic talk by LDS prophet Ezra Taft Benson, he names pride as a common offense to all men. But I think his definition of pride fits well with this understanding of racism. He says, the central feature of pride, or racism in our case, is enmity. Enmity toward God and enmity toward our fellow men. Enmity means hatred toward, hostility to, or state of opposition. The evils of pride, enmity, and racism are not just in the things we do, or in the things we think and the things we believe. The state of mind of an individual. The hostile us versus them type of mentality that erodes that brotherly love. We accept Jesus' universal love, that he invites all to come unto him and partake of his goodness, both black and white, bond and free, male and female. Like our SVU family, his aim was to gather. But I think his actions speak louder than his words alone. Years ago, a close friend asked me how I thought Jesus would handle the subject of racism. After some pondering, I returned to her with an example from John chapter 4, a story commonly referred to as the woman at the well. In this story, Jesus approaches a Samaritan woman at a well and asks her for a drink. The woman was confused because reminding Jesus of the hostility between the Jews and the Samaritans. Now, the Samaritans were a racially diverse group. They were in northern Israel. They had been invaded by Assyrians and Babylonians, so they had a mixed culture, a mixed race, and mixed religion. And they're generally despised by the rest of the Israelites. But of course, Jesus knew this. Growing up in Israel, you can't imagine Jesus being ignorant of these type of hostilities. But despite that cultural prejudice that existed, and probably even because of it, he approached this woman So that's the first key. The second step is that he met her on her turf. So the location of that well was in Sychar. So it was Jacob's well. It's a contested area, but Sychar was in a Samaritan city. So Jesus went to her neighborhood, to speak with her. But perhaps more importantly is he knew her. If you're familiar with the story, he goes on to share intimate details about her life, how many husbands she'd had, and her current situation. The woman is shocked and humbled because besides knowing her racial history, she also knows her personal history. Jesus knows her as an individual, and he didn't judge her. I'd encourage you to read John chapter 4 with new eyes if you're unfamiliar with it. But to summarize my response to my friend, I explained that Jesus was able to navigate these racial tensions by first, understanding the cultural and historical context. Second, meeting her at her level, in her neighborhood. And lastly, by knowing another as an individual. Now, none of us have the same type of insight that Jesus has, but we can ask questions and get to know one another. Similarly, Jesus used these same racial distinctions in the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man from Jerusalem, a Jew, was left for dead by a group of bandits. Members of his own race, a Levite and a priest, passed over by him. It was the Samaritan, a different individual, an inferior, who stopped by to help this victim. I wonder, what would the story of the Good Samaritan look like to each of you? If you were on the side of the road, left for dead, who would be your Samaritan? Someone you least expect to help you. Someone from a different race, religion, nationality, a different sexuality? I think the answer to that question will help you understand how to overcome this type of racism. The second evil of our modern society is poverty. In his speech on the three evils, Dr. King said, "Now there is nothing new about poverty. It's been with us for years and centuries. What is new at this point, though, is that we now have the resources, we now have the skills, we now have the techniques to get rid of poverty. And the question is whether our nation has the will." That was written over 50 years ago, half a century. How are we doing with that? I hope none of you are currently or will ever experience poverty. I hope that you have prosperous careers and lives, but I also hope you're aware of the lives and conditions that millions of Americans live in every day. So as mentioned, I work in legal aid. So for those unfamiliar with legal aid organizations exist throughout the United States, and they're designed to provide civil legal assistance to people living at or around the poverty line. So the poverty line for an individual, for one individual, I think it's about $1,500 a month is the federal poverty line. We reach up a little bit higher than that, but still not a whole lot of money, especially if you're trying to support a family. And about once a month, I'll attend eviction court. It's a proceeding that happens in Columbus where hundreds of people are facing evictions daily. Hundreds of people daily. And that's just in my hometown. There's almost 1 million people there, but still every day, hundreds of people are facing eviction. About 35,000 people lose their homes every year in Columbus. And the problem is actually proportionally worse in nearby Richmond, where 10% of the population, more than 10% of the population, face some sort of eviction. Now, the number one reason for eviction is lack of ability to pay rent. I've met with dozens of families who have lost their homes, their apartments, because they had to pay medical expenses. They had funeral expenses. They took a day off of work to take care of a sick child. Despite the low unemployment rate in the U.S., wages have barely budged, and most new jobs are those that offer these minimum wages that you can't live off of. This is unacceptable. In the Book of Mormon, economic inequality is repeatedly mentioned as an indicator of a failing Nephite society. I encourage you to study 3rd and 4th Nephi to see what I mean. But in 3rd Nephi, before the coming of Christ, Mormon laments, "The people began to be distinguished by ranks according to their riches and their chances for learning. Yea, some were ignorant because of their poverty, and others did receive great learning because of their riches." By 4th Nephi, after these class distinctions have solidified, Mormon writes, "And from that time forth, they did have their goods and their substance no more common among them. And they began to be divided into classes, and they began to build up churches unto themselves to get gain." That was the breaking point, when they no longer shared their goods. And as the Nephites split into classes, they started to build up churches, institutions, to hold on to that wealth. Later on, they start doing underhanded dealings and backroom dealings with the Gadianton robbers. All of these corruptions lead to the downfall of the Nephites. The Lamanites are easily able to overpower them because of the internal failings. But one of the first steps was this economic inequality. I believe we see some of the same things today. As members of our Southern Virginia University family, I hope you'll be in the moral offensive against poverty. I hope you use your education to lift. Like I said, I hope you have prosperous careers, but I hope you take the time to participate and assist organizations and people in poverty. I hope you get close to the problem. Because what concerns me most, besides the crippling effects of poverty, is the rhetoric and some of the attitudes towards people in poverty. I too often hear this type of refrain that Mosiah or King Benjamin criticizes in the Book of Mormon. Perhaps thou shalt say, the man has brought upon himself his misery. Therefore I will stay my hand and will not give unto him of my food, nor impart unto him of my substance that he may not suffer, for his punishments are just. That's ridiculous. What about the kids? There are other people involved with this. And we're probably not consciously critical of people in poverty, but I'm worried about these unconscious biases we may have, especially towards people who appear to be causing their own suffering, people with drug addictions, people with criminal records, people with multiple children from multiple partners. Some may say that perhaps people could make different choices. All right. Each of these people may experience things, maybe in severe financial hardship because of these experiences. But in my experience, many of these people have experienced significant trauma, abuse, or an untreated mental illness. Sometimes a person's circumstance prevents them from making the best decision. And as a side note, I'll candidly say that, because we tend to excuse or forgive people in the past for doing things because it was a product of their time. I think that's okay. But I think if we're going to excuse people in the past for the wrongs they've done, we need to excuse people now and offer that same mercy, that same forgiveness to people who are products of their circumstance. But even if an individual is totally responsible for all the bad things that happen in his life, I hope we recall the words of Jesus in the Doctrine and Covenants. Remember, the worth of souls is great. There are no exceptions. The last plague of modern society, King argues, is war. Now, the Vietnam War was in full swing during King's lifetime, and he was an outright opponent of it. It was really unpopular. The draft had disproportionate impact on economically and socially disadvantaged individuals. And the American public was faced for the first time with 24-hour news coverage of the war, seeing the atrocities firsthand. And as the American body count continued to pile up, support for the war waned. Now, the violence of war is reprehensible, but King was also concerned with some of the broader effects of war. He said, "We have left ourselves as a nation morally and politically isolated in the world. We have greatly strengthened the forces of reaction in America and excited violence and hatred among our own people. We have diverted attention from civil rights. During a period of war, when a nation becomes obsessed with guns of war, social programs inevitably suffer. People become insensitive to pain and agony in their own." So he's highlighted here several symptoms of war: isolation, reactivity, hatred, violence, distraction, insensitivity to suffering. Those are some of the symptoms of war. Do any of these sound familiar? I see isolation with our political echo chambers. I see knee-jerk reactions to social media comments. I see mass shootings and organized hatred. I see us being endlessly distracted by sports, social media, and politics. I see a lack of concern for the suffering of the poor, the needy, the refugees. I see us in a war at home. But I think better of you, and I think better of all of us. And I think all of us have some improvements to make. Because we're on the moral offensive, we must be engaged in this war. But we must do it in a way that's morally right. Let's look at an example of one of the greatest warriors in the Book of Mormon to see what that might look like. Now, Captain Moroni was chosen to lead the Nephite army when a Nephite dissenter, Amalickiah, stirred up Lamanite resentment toward the Nephites. And Moroni is described as a man of perfect understanding, yea, a man that did not delight in bloodshed, a man whose soul did joy in the liberty and the freedom of his country, and his brethren from bondage and slavery. Yea, a man whose heart did swell with thanksgiving to his God for the many privileges and blessings which he bestowed upon his people, a man who did labor exceedingly for the welfare and safety of his people. Thanksgiving, a perfect understanding, not delighting in bloodshed. Those aren't the normal characteristics we associate with a warrior. But Moroni was different. He was motivated by a pure love of Christ and of his fellow man. Dr. King practiced nonviolence, a philosophy and a technique founded in passive resistance and non-cooperation. Now we can look back and see those tools in that movement and see that they were effective. But at the time, it was a lot harder to swallow. King once wrote, "A member of my church came to me one day and solemnly suggested that it would be to our advantage to kill off 8 or 10 white people. This is the only language these white folks will understand." Other parishioners said they could avoid being violent so long as violence wasn't directed towards them. Nonviolence seemed like suicide to many of these people. With the murders, assassinations, beatings, lynchings, Birmingham was nicknamed Bombingham because of the number of bombings that occurred at black civil rights activist homes. This was terrorism, and nonviolence didn't seem like an option. But it was effective. As history has shown us, weapons of nonviolence are effective against the weapons of violence. They may be difficult to wield effectively, but looking at history, we can see that they've been effective. One last scripture. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." This verse has been a source of humble strength for me as I've thought about my duty in being on the moral offensive. The moral offensive isn't a fight against any individual or an organization, but against incorrect teachings, philosophies, and systems. It's not a physical fight, it's a spiritual fight. I'm so thankful for all of you attending this university. It's a wonderful place, and I see great things coming from here. I hope you'll ponder the things that I've shared with you and think about your duty and your ability to be on the moral offensive in combating racism, poverty, and war. I hope that you'll go forth from here with a deeper love of Christ and a commitment to follow him. I share this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.